Many of the most famous archaeological sites, such as Athens and Rome, have never been lost to time, and so did not require a process of discovery. Archaeologists were simply able to go there and begin digging. However, most new finds today occur at more remote sites, which are often pretty far removed from the beaten path. These are sites which are not as prominently featured in the literary record, if they're featured in the literary record at all, and they also don't stick out as obviously in the modern landscape as sites which still have standing buildings which remain from antiquity. So that, of course, raises the question, how do archaeologists today find new sites? The answer is that they employ survey archaeology. Survey archaeology is the most common method of locating new sites and or finding lost sites that we might know about by name. Survey archaeology is the practice by which archaeologists examine the countryside looking for new places that they can excavate. We might think of archaeology as being more or less defined by the act of excavation, but due to the expense of excavation, it is really important for archaeologists to understand what they're hoping to accomplish with their excavation before they undertake digging. So in this video, we're going to look at how survey archaeology works and also talk about how archaeologists are still locating new sites here and there using survey archaeology. Broadly speaking, the question that we hope to answer is how archaeologists go about searching for lost cities and other new sources of artifacts. One way is that archaeologists will look at areas that their predecessors have ignored based on probability. And what I mean by that is they'll look at a place which might have been a good and favorable settlement site in the past. So based on geography, based on proximity to other known settlements, based on access to resources, the fertility of the land, etc., it's often a good idea to survey places that seem to be plausible sites for ancient cities and farmsteads. For the most part, the landscape hasn't altered that dramatically over the last 2,000 to 3,000 years, so typically things are relatively similar in terms of the level of habitability, at least in places like Greece and Italy. Another way that archaeologists can potentially find new sites is to consult local traditions. Often, people who live in villages will hike around the outskirts of where they live and sometimes stumble upon sherds of pottery or other things which make them think that there was once an ancient settlement around. It's also not unknown for archaeologists to look into the rumor mill about where different artifacts are coming from. Oftentimes, treasure hunters will go around to obscure corners and look for things they can find and then hawk. So actually, we'll look later in the course at one very famous recent finding where actually treasure hunters were decades ahead of the curve, and archaeologists only really started to excavate around 2019, whereas treasure hunters were visiting the site for many decades before that point. Another way is, as I mentioned, simple geographical probability. If a site is located along a river, or if it's strategically located between two major centers and it would serve as a good trade hub, if it controls a mountain pass that has strategic value, then all of these kinds of sites could be places that you can examine to try to find various kinds of remains, whether we're talking about a mountain town or a trade center, if there's a nice port nearby, or a fortress. It just depends on what you're looking for. If you just examine the terrain, you can find places that seem obvious. Now, this doesn't work all the time, of course, but sometimes it very much does. Another method, which also sometimes bears fruit, is for archaeologists to revisit old sites, often with new eyes and new tools. Sometimes previous surveys were either undermanned or too hasty and broad, or they didn't bring along modern tools which can sometimes detect things that just a more cursory glance with one's own eyes might not pick up. So these are the basic methods of finding new sites. And we'll see that this last method, revisiting old surveys, can and has paid off. And we'll look at one site where this is paying off right now in a very big way. Archaeological surveys are not all the same. Different surveys seek to accomplish different purposes. All surveys are either extensive or intensive, and intrusive or non-intrusive. So of these four categories, each survey would have to be either an extensive or intensive search, and either be intrusive or non-intrusive. So you can have an extensive intrusive, you can have an extensive non-intrusive, an intensive intrusive, or an intensive non-intrusive survey. Let's examine what each of these categories entails. An extensive survey looks at a large area but does not do so in painstaking detail. An extensive survey would give you a pretty good idea of whether there is, say, a city in the area. But it would not necessarily give you that great of an idea about whether there are individual houses that are sort of isolated from each other. It might not also locate things such as buried well shafts or lost milestones, which might tell you whose property it is, or a random individual grave. It'd be unlikely to find stuff like that, but if there was enough there, then the extensive survey would be likely to discover it. So these are kind of surveys that you might do if you're looking at an area and you're just kind of doing a shot in the dark deal to find something that you can investigate in greater detail, because obviously an extensive survey is not going to produce enough data on its own to be the be-all and end-all of an investigation. By contrast, an intensive survey is a painstaking look at a smaller area. So in an intensive survey, you would have a team really scour the ground of a smaller, well-defined area, and in this case, you would find a lot of the smaller things that might go undiscovered in an extensive survey. So you'd be much more likely to find things like individual graves, milestones, small houses, things of that nature. And also you'd be much more likely to uncover more artifacts, since you're looking much more carefully at the ground and covering a much higher percentage of it. Now you have to decide how intrusive you will be with your team. Many surveys are non-intrusive because the idea is to find stuff to look at in greater detail later. So most surveys are non-intrusive. And a non-intrusive survey just records what the team finds, but it does not involve disturbing or removing artifacts. If you happen to detect something a foot below the surface, for instance, you won't dig it out and take it with you. You would instead just record that at this location there is something buried. And then a future excavation would be sent out to deal with that. An intensive survey, by contrast, is one where the people who are looking at the area have permission to remove artifacts. So that is the difference. Because there are quite a few rules now in archaeology when it comes to taking artifacts, especially if you're taking them out of country, most of these broad surveys tend to be non-intrusive these days, but it is still possible to get permission to do a more intrusive survey. It really just depends on the circumstances. Perhaps the most time-tested and kind of iconic way to go about doing a survey is to engage in what is known as field walking. In a field walk, people will line up, usually led by an archaeologist, but mostly consisting of workers and volunteers, students, whoever happens to be there. You line up and then you move systematically across a predefined grid, looking at the ground, searching for anything of interest. Some of the things that you'll look for include pottery fragments, which give you a good indication of there being previous activity here. If you're going across a plowed field, pottery fragments often are disturbed and brought to the surface, so that is why pottery fragments tend to be one of the things people look for above other things. There are other possible indications that one might find. So, for instance, if there is sort of an odd rise in the ground or some sort of impression that makes it look like there's something buried, a former foundation of a building, whatever it might be, that could also be something that might catch the eye of a field walker and call for further investigation. This method, of course, is only used outside of known cities. This is used mostly in farms and empty fields. It's perhaps most effective in cultivated fields where it's more likely that you would turn up pottery fragments. And a lot of times it would be farmers themselves who would see things and then call local authorities, and that would lead to some investigation. This is a traditional method. It's pretty affordable. There are labor costs, but they're usually not super high, at least not compared with more technologically intense survey methods. And this is a pretty effective, if not quite sensitive, approach to just determine whether there is enough there to bother with a more extensive investigation. The best example that I can think of a site which was located due to survey archaeology is Strongilovuni. This was a mid-sized polis located on a hill in western Thessaly. We don't know the actual name of this site in antiquity, but we do know, based on archaeology, that it flourished in the classical and Hellenistic periods. It is located near the modern village of Vlokos. People have noticed for a long time that there used to be something here and that there was something worth investigating, but for whatever reason, previous surveys tended to think that this was a pretty minor site, and so it was never really prioritized by earlier archaeologists. Over time, however, people have been revisiting the site, and each time people go back, they find that this site was more significant than they realized. Interestingly enough, as early as 1921, this would be at a time when archaeologists were convinced that this site was pretty minor, there was one bold soul who wrote a book about Homer's catalog of ships, and he opined that Strongilovuni was what was meant by, I forget the name of the city in Homer, but it was some city which was listed in the catalog and had sent a fairly substantial number of ships. I imagine that most of the people who read his work at the time, not being all that interested in archaeology, probably didn't know what he was talking about, and the people who did would have laughed. But over time, as we've realized that the site was actually fairly respectable in size, this wild, from-the-hip shot is becoming more and more plausible, which usually is not the case. But in this one instance, we had probably a classicist who just took a shot from the hip, and it looks like it wasn't quite as reckless as it looked at first. The first survey at Strongilovuni was in 1803. They didn't really find that much, and at this point, archaeology was still in its infancy. There were so many bigger, better-known sites that no one really bothered to think about it any further. People didn't really start to come back until about the 60s. And from the 60s to the 90s, there were more significant finds as team after team found that the site was bigger than they realized, that the city had been larger and had more stuff available. But only since about 2016 have archaeologists really put in an effort to excavate the entire site. And now we understand that this was a fairly impressive site, which gives us a lot of insight into the Greek polis in the classical and then the Hellenistic period. The team that is currently working on this is a Swedish-American team, by the way, and although I'm sure they've had their interruptions due to COVID, so far as I'm aware, this project is still going on and will probably continue for a few more years. We can, of course, go beyond traditional methods. Archaeologists have at their disposal more technologically sophisticated means of trying to locate lost sites. Two of these, perhaps the two most important, are aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar. Often these methods are used in conjunction with more traditional methods such as field walking. Aerial photography is especially useful because from above you can typically get an impression of the land, and sometimes things that are buried underneath the ground will leave an impression on the ground above them, which is not as obvious on the surface level, but if you view it from above from a different perspective, sometimes it's more obvious that there is something beneath the soil. Of course, this requires you to hire either fixed-wing aircraft or helicopters, and that can get rather expensive. Another tool that archaeologists love to employ is the ground-penetrating radar pictured here. This, of course, can see through the ground and give you an idea of what is directly beneath the surface, but these tools can be rather expensive, and it's not so simple as you just have a radar pointed down and then you know exactly what's there. You need to have both an extensive knowledge of archaeology and geology in order to correctly interpret what you're finding. So the results don't necessarily speak for themselves, and it requires a lot of interpretation. Another thing to keep in mind is that archaeology is not super well funded, so using methods such as these requires careful budgeting, and you have to direct them sparingly because your budget will not be that generous. Which leads us to the final point of today's lecture. Unlike the bad old days of archaeology, where gentlemen scholars with a lot of money wandered about, bribed local officials, and just started digging wherever they damn well pleased, in today's world, you have to approach things with a great deal more circumspection. In order to get a permit to excavate and then get enough funding from your home institution, from various grants, and from generous private individuals, you really need to do a great deal of homework ahead of time. An archaeologist trying to seek money to start a grant will have to get permission from the country where they're digging. Some countries, of course, are easier to work with than others. You then have to usually pay a permit fee, which can be pretty steep. To be the person in charge of the dig, you will need to show some expertise. You will have to have a PhD in the field and have relevant experience. You probably need to have worked under another archaeologist for a fair amount of time before you'd be entrusted with something this important. So this means both getting a permit from a government and also getting money from people. And you need to, most of all, make a strong case for why you should be allowed to dig at this area and what you would be likely to find. What will be the benefit for scholarship if you dug at this site? What kinds of artifacts might you produce that you can then give to the Greek government to display at their museums? And what kinds of artifacts will you be able to bring back for your home institution for them to send you to this place for months on end? What can you do for the National Endowment for the Humanities if they're going to be giving you money? So you have to answer a lot of questions and effectively grease a lot of palms, and that requires being able to argue persuasively that your project will in fact achieve all of the goals that all of the various funders and power brokers might have for it. And that's why survey archaeology, while it is less glamorous and less likely to result in things which really gain a lot of public acclaim, it is actually, I would say, the bread and butter of archaeology in many ways, because this is sort of the pre-screening which allows archaeologists to go out and really do what they do best. And in today's world, because of this process that I'm talking about, investigating sites ahead of time often takes longer than excavations themselves. And this is becoming increasingly the case. So recently, the Greek-American archaeologist Eleni Korka, after working for nearly 40 years to get a permit, finally began excavating at Tenea. And unfortunately for her, she started to hear rumors about a site in 1984 when she was a young archaeologist. She was too young at that point to be able to get a permit because people didn't think she was sufficiently experienced. So she kept collecting evidence over many years that this site was worth excavating. She finally got her permit in 2019, and it was only then, or she might have gotten her permit a little before that, but in 2019 she was able to confirm that the site was what she had claimed all along. And then, of course, COVID hit, and then her excavation gets interrupted. So another lesson, I guess, that we have to keep in mind with archaeology is that patience is very, very, very important, and that there will be probably 8 setbacks for every advancement. So anyway, that is all I have for you this week. Next week there will be more than one lecture, but we will not be covering anything quite as fundamental to the art of archaeology as survey archaeology.